let's get started. I want to welcome everybody to the National Intelligence and Foreign Policy in the Biden administration. What to expect our special panel tonight. Thank you for joining us. My name is Matt Auer. I'm the Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia. And a couple ground rules. This is a webinar, so we can't see you or hear you, but we can see your questions. If you put those questions into the and answer link or box there, send those to us, and then we can share those with our guests. And our guests tonight are Loch Johnson. Loch Johnson is the Regents Professor Emeritus of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia. Loch is the author of more than 200 articles and essays, and the author and editor of 30 books on U.S. national security. I really think of Loch as the quintessential scholar practitioner, considering that he spent so much time in Congress in executive staff positions on issues of national intelligence, including serving as the special assistant to the chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in 1975 through 76. Those were the church years and the important work that was done at that time. He was also staff aide on the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee and served as the first staff director of the Subcommittee on Intelligence Oversight and many other positions into the 90s, working as special assistant to Les Aspin on the Aspin-Brown Commission on the roles and missions of intelligence. Professor Johnson has served as secretary of the American Political Science Association South, and actually I take that back, the American Political Science Association, and then president of the International Studies Association South. He was the distinguished visiting scholar at Yale University and also at Oxford. And in 2012, he was the inaugural SEC professor at the University of Georgia. He has won the William A. Owens Award, the university's highest research award in the social and behavioral sciences, and its creative research award as well. Many accolades, but I'll just skip down to what Loch will consider ancient history, but he got his PhD in political science at the University of California at Riverside. And at the University of Georgia, he was one of the founders of the School of Public and International Affairs in 2000. So he's the reason that I'm here. So thank you, Loch. Our second guest is Fred Monge. Fred is a former Deputy General Counsel of the Central Intelligence Agency. Most of his 26 careers in the Office of the General Counsel as a legal advisor in a number of positions, and served 18 years in the Senior Intelligence Service, which is the CIA's equivalent of the Senior Executive Service. So, Acting Director of Congressional Affairs, many other positions in the community. The cases that he's dealt with, I think, will be familiar to many of you. He's had a hand in some key cases in the history of U.S. intelligence, including the prosecution of terrorist Fawaz Yunus, who was a Lebanese hijacker, if I remember correctly. The spy, he was engaged in that affair, the conviction, work on that. The Millennium Terrorist Threat, the Iran-Contra affair, the lost Vietnamese commandos, USA Patriot Act, the President's WND Commission, and numerous other cases and contexts. He also served as the CIA's officer in residence at the University of Georgia, also at Florida State University. In 2002, he received the Attorney General's Distinguished Service Award for the support work that he did on the prosecutions of the 1998 bombings of the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, those prosecutions. He also received the Department of Justice Public Service Award for his work in the Ames espionage case. He's also published many articles. Mr. Monge spent 32 years in the military reserves and retired in 2005 as a colonel in the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General's Corps. He received his BA degree in political science from the University of Georgia with the highest honors in summa cum laude, and then was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. He then went on to receive his Juris Doctor degree from Vanderbilt University School of Law. Welcome, Mr. Monge. And finally, our moderator is Thomasville native Brian Quinif. He is vice president at HSBC in New York. He earned 2 bachelor's degrees and an MA from the University of Georgia and was a foundation fellow while an undergraduate. That's the highest academic honor and fellowship you can have at UGA. And one of the nice things that comes with it is opportunities to study and travel abroad, and Brian did that. He studied in Innsbruck, Austria, and he also had internships in Barcelona and in Rio de Janeiro. The time he spent in Spain and in Brazil enabled him to become very proficient in Spanish and Portuguese. And he combined that with some training he did at the London School of Economics to get where he is today with those language skills, which he probably didn't necessarily get at SPIA, but he probably got in the Romance Language Department here. It's not surprising that today he is working the currency trading desk at HSBC. Welcome, Brian. And with that, Brian, if you could take over.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dean Auer. And I was briefly a political science major, thanks to Loch Johnson's influence. And even though I didn't finish the major, I took a number of classes in SPIA and did research with Dr. Johnson, and it was a great time there. So sorry for not finishing that degree. But thank you everyone for joining. I'm sorry that we can't be there in person, but one of the upsides of the pandemic we find ourselves in is we find the ability to share time and ideas together, even if we're at a distance. So thanks to our 2 speakers, and I think that each like to maybe give a few opening remarks before we open up to your questions. So Loch, why don't you kick us off, please?
Well, thank you, Brian, and Dean Auer. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And may I say, there's no better dean on the face of the earth than Dean Auer. And I say that after knowing quite a few of them over the years. So we're proud to have you at SPIA, Matt. I would also like to thank a number of people who organized this event, and among them, certainly Laura Baines, who sort of masterminded and taught us how to conduct ourselves in this event. And then Caroline Pikowski has always been a big help in trying to get these events going. And, you know, over the years, I've known thousands of CIA people, and I would put Fred Monge as among the top 4 or 5 that I've ever known from that organization in terms of his competence and achievement. So it's a great honor to be on this program with him. And Brian, at the risk of embarrassing him, I have to say would be among the top 4 or 5 students I've had in the 40 years that I was at UGA. So I'm deeply honored to be with this group. Let me also thank those of you who are viewing this program. I want to express my appreciation for you tuning in. I think there are some 420 of you, and I wish we, at the end of this program, could all go down to Jittery Joe's and have a coffee. I suppose that'd be quite a scene with 420 of us in Jittery Joe's, and it might violate some social distancing rules, but it would be a lot of fun. Let me also note just quickly that I'm so grateful, as is my wife, for the support for the Johnson Fund. It's helping so many students go to the University of Georgia who otherwise couldn't do it. So my heartfelt appreciation to all of those of you who are supporting the fund. Finally, I would just note quickly that we're talking about world events tonight mainly, and it reminds me of the Murphy Commission, which convened back in the 70s, and it said memorably that we must live in the world we find, not in the world we wish. And that's so true, unfortunately. And that world today is fragmented. It's in some ways shapeless. I see the beginnings of a bipolar relationship between China and the United States, which reminds me a little bit about the Cold War, with us versus the Soviets, although I don't think the Chinese are quite as vicious as Joseph Stalin was back in the Cold War days. But nonetheless, it's an uncertain and dangerous world that we live in. And I think forums like this are very important so we can begin to educate ourselves more about how to cope in that world. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Loch. Fred, what do you have to say?
Ryan, let me add my appreciation for you and Loch pitching in for this great occasion. My admiration for Loch as an old colleague and friend and expert is unbounded. I had the occasion, as Dean Auer mentioned, to lecture at SPIA a few years ago, and I just felt the quality of the faculty, the staff, the students was just outstanding. When they asked me to participate in the webinar, and it had to do with what to expect with the new Biden administration, I thought, well, the answer is easy. Just do the exact opposite from what the Trump administration did. But it's more subtle than that. Began to read some tea leaves. The president has mentioned, current President Biden mentioned during a number of speeches, he wished to address 4 crises, the pandemic, the economy, climate change, racial injustice as well. But the first 3 clearly have extensive international connections that will implicate everything that the myriad parts of the intelligence community are involved in. And in addition, the new National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, gave several interviews and mentioned that they intended to follow a foreign policy for the middle class, an emphasis clearly on economic issues. Foreign policy is domestic policy and vice versa, he told NPR. He said they meant to bridge foreign policy and national security decision-making in DC with the lives of everyday Americans. This is a new emphasis. It has a number of implications, especially in the world of counterintelligence, countering industrial espionage by foreign governments and entities. The perennial question of industrial espionage on behalf of the United States, should we or shouldn't we do that? And in addition to that, the rules of engagement involving US persons that Loch was there at the creation. We owe the modern intelligence community structure and rules of engagement to Loch, who was there at the beginning. So when I'm looking at what to expect, I would say if I can glean what might be the Biden doctrine, I would say it is a focus on engagement with other democracies to bolster, to strengthen, to enhance alliances with them, to outcompete and outlast the dictators. And with that, I think there's a robust role across the intelligence community, some 17 members as I recollect presently, but also with my home agency at CIA.
Thanks very much, Fred. So your comments, I think, bring us to a question asking about, I'll paraphrase a bit, but how does the change in administration affect the CIA, both in terms of objectives and methods of operation? You touched in your comments to some of the objectives and how the Biden administration will be looking at things a bit differently, but how does that translate to the CIA's objectives and how it seeks to put into effect those objectives?
Well, the feeling about every time a new administration comes in with generally a new director, in this case, the director of CIA, to paraphrase an old client of mine, it's like the Scottish tribes waiting for the English king. Methods are not so much changed by administrations. There's mostly driven by technology and the targets. So the methodology remains what is passed before in previous administrations and probably what will be passed to future administrations, only driven by changes in technology and targeting. But the objectives are malleable. The general rule of what CIA does, which I've told lay persons, is it steals secrets, it catches spies, stops terrorists, produces all sorts of analysis, and some covert action on the side. That doesn't change. What does change and what will change probably in the Biden administration quite substantively is dependent upon the circumstances of the president, the current president, and the National Security Council. They are the clients for whom the entire community, but especially CIA, serve directly, and the directions and priorities that each of the new administrations bring at the top level. The president and the principals in the NSC will turn the toolbox that CIA has, the objectives of stealing secrets and producing analysis, towards whatever their priorities will be.
Thank you. So turning to the appointments and the new administration, Loch, what are your thoughts on the appointments that have been made thus far? And, maybe to use the language from my line of work, who are you buying and who are you selling?
Well, I must say I'm excited about the new team. Let's take, for example, William Burns, who will be the new director of the CIA. This fellow's had an incredible experience. He's with the Carnegie Center for Peace and International Affairs, as you know. But if you look at his career, he's really been one of our top diplomats. And he's been our ambassador to Russia, which in many ways is our major adversary today. And he's just had a wonderful career. I would note that what this probably means is that he's going to be more acutely interested in analysis, that is, the CIA's assessment of what's going on in the world, than has been true with a lot of other directors. Some of the directors come out of the operations side, and many of them, by the way, have been quite good. I'm a big fan of Bill Colby, for example, who was an operations type. But I'm also a big fan of Bob Gates when he was director of the CIA, and he was an analyst. So here we've got someone like that. The only hesitation I would have, and I'd love to hear Fred's comment on this, is that sometimes there's been some real tension between the State Department and the CIA, particularly overseas in the stations, because sometimes the CIA will be doing one thing, maybe even trying to overthrow a country, while on the other side, the ambassador is trying to have cordial relations with that country. So I don't want to overstate that, because normally the relationship between CIA people in the field and the diplomats is quite good, but occasionally it's been tense. And I think it's fair to say that if you walked over to Foggy Bottom and talked to some of the people at State, they might not have most wonderful things to say about the CIA on all occasions. So there is that tension, but I believe that Burns will be able to overcome that. And then David Cohen is going to be his deputy. And what I particularly like about him is that he's had a lot of experience in the Department of Treasury on trying to go after financing of terrorist groups. And this is extremely important. And we've got to know where Al-Qaeda and ISIS and others are getting their money. And also, some people are saying if Putin wants to play hardball, then maybe we ought to know where he stashes his money. And maybe even one day, if he continues to be so belligerent, his money may disappear from the banks in Switzerland or wherever they might be. So David Cohen is a real expert on international terrorism. That'll be a valuable addition. And then finally, you have Avril Haynes, and she's got an extraordinary background. I particularly like the idea that she has an undergraduate degree in physics, plus a law degree. So she brings a lot of technical expertise to the position. The only thing that slightly bothers me about her, and I have some reservations, is that when she was at the CIA, she made a decision not to punish any of the CIA people who were hacking into the Senate Intelligence Staff Committee computers on the Hill. And that was, if I may say so, an outrageous thing for them to have done. We could spend a whole session talking about why that happened, but I really do think those people who hacked into the US Senate Intelligence Committee from the CIA should have received some kind of punishment. Finally, let me say that what I like most of all about this group is that they all know each other and they're friends. And that's so important to have to ensure cooperation. Compare that to the Reagan administration. I once talked to someone in the Reagan administration. He said to me, think of someone you really hate, multiply that by 100 and raise it to the 10th power. And that's how the Secretary of State felt toward the Secretary of Defense and vice versa. And both of those people hated William Casey, who was the CIA director. Now that's a heck of a way to run a government when everyone hates each other. So here you've got a group of people who are going to be running our intelligence agencies, at least some of them, and they know each other, they like each other, they've worked together before, and I think that's a big plus.
Do you have any comments to share on that topic?
No, I concur with Loch. It's a new team. I think we used to say personnel is policy. And what you'll have here, I think, is strikingly better coordination, better competence, better, fewer amateurs, lesser turnover. These people have worked together on major problems that arose in the Obama administration and are still there. And so I think the pivot that we will see in the Biden administration will be away from the counter-terrorist military kinetic orientation that we inherited from 9/11 and before to more global power competition, especially with China. And so if you had to line up people like Burns, like Tony Blinken, that's a really good team to handle that pivot.
Brian, just if I may jump in quickly on a related point, you know, all of this is moot if people over in government who are making decisions don't listen to the intelligence community. And I think this group will. I think Joe Biden and all the rest realize the importance of knowing what's going on in the world. They understand the notion that intelligence is all about giving decision advantage to the president and others. Now compare that to the Trump administration, where we're told Trump had no interest in intelligence whatsoever. He refused initially to have the president's daily brief. He finally allowed the oral briefer to talk to him about it, but he'd never read the report, evidently. So here you've got an $80 billion organization called the intelligence community with 17 different agencies. And the most important consumer, the president of the United States, could have cared less. In fact, he said once that he was pretty good himself at international affairs and he had good instincts for it. And so he relied mainly on his own judgments, which reminded me of the Roman empires who would read the entrails of animals that they threw on the ground. It's about the same kind of approach.
Yeah, they'll be in good condition if they just remember one of the eternal verities of the intelligence world, and that is there are no policy failures. There are only intelligence failures.
Good to keep a sense of humor. So this question, I think we could really go to either of you or maybe both of you. So we've touched kind of tangentially a couple of times on the topic of China, industrial espionage. One thing that's come up in a couple of questions I'm seeing are people asking about cybersecurity. That's something that's on a lot of people's minds, and also the concept of a perhaps bipolar relationship or even a second Cold War with China. It seems that one of the few things the Republicans and the Democrats seem to agree on to some degree is the challenge coming from China. So, how can we think about that from the intelligence perspective, whether it's combating cyber threats or protecting industrial security, or are we playing offense or defense? Fred, why don't you start us off on that one?
It's a whole new world, Brian. The arena of cyberspace is developing even as we speak here. We used to talk about back in the old days when it was beginning about computer network exploitation, which is just classic espionage, just hacking into, breaking into, stealing secrets that are digitized. And then in other cases, we talked about computer network attack, which is actually causing some damage, doing something to mess with other computer networks. In both of those instances, the intelligence community plays a large hand, not just CIA, but others, NSA in particular, our SIGINT agency, Cyber Command in the Defense Department. China is to paraphrase Churchill about Russia, it is in many ways an open country, but in the most important ways as to what are their intentions, it's very closed. It's very much a target. And when I mention a pivot to China, I think the model that foreign policy will follow with Biden and bringing along the analysis which Loch adverted to is China is not a Cold War containment type of place. It's more of a strategic competitor, but it is aggressive lately. And the one thing that does seem to be carried over from the Trump administration is a harder line with China, treating it more as an adversary than just a country that if we brought it into the World Trade Organization or opened trade with it and allowed it to access to US markets and US equity, that they would liberalize and become less aggressive, become less of an adversary, which has not happened. So I think you'll see a harder line. I don't think it'll be a trade war, But then again, the national intelligence community offers quite a lot by way of trying to figure out, trying to read the tea leaves of what the Chinese Communist Party means, what it intends to do, but also hard lines against things like democracy in Hong Kong. Taiwan is a big flashpoint. Human rights with the Uyghur concentration camps that seem to be going on in Western China. Not so much from we're going to do something about it in the intelligence community, but that we can explain it better to those that are trying to come up with some way to confront China on all those axes.
It's certainly a challenge, and the CEO of my firm was testifying in front of British members of Parliament yesterday, and was being pressed very hard about the role of the bank in Hong Kong, and not standing quote unquote standing up to China and these things, and private firms face the challenge of wanting to do business in the world's largest country, not the largest economy yet, but then also having to face the tension of different values in different countries. So it's not just the governments that are facing these challenges; private actors as well do to a large degree. Forgive me for speaking for just a moment, but Loch, what are your thoughts on the topic?
Well, let me turn first to China, then I want to broaden the question a little bit. On the Chinese example, let me suggest that compared to the Soviet Union back in the 1940s under Joe Stalin, the Chinese have really been quite restrained, I think. They haven't really tried to expand their borders outward. I know they're building some special bases in South China Sea, which can be worrisome, but think of what the Soviet Union did right after World War II, the way they occupied all of Eastern Europe, basically, and Manchuria. So I think the chances for cooperation and coexistence, peaceful coexistence with China, are quite good. After all, we both really need each other very much. We're both major trading partners with one another. Now, more broadly, I think it's sobering to realize, and I hate to say this because this is my research specialty, intelligence, and I find it very important, but a lot of the most important problems facing the United States really have nothing to do whatsoever with intelligence. So when we think about threats to the United States, I think about disseminating our vaccines for the virus. I think of the income inequality in this country and the need for better job training. I think of the really heartbreaking political polarization I see in this country right now, where we've developed a Senate that's almost completely dysfunctional, can't seem to do anything. I think of the ongoing pollution and the need for electric cars and other responses, or our voting situation where the American people, large numbers of them, have no faith in the validity of our voting system. I would love to see a presidential commission on voting in America to make sure that that's a more transparent activity. And at the same time, that commission could look at gerrymandering, which has, I think, been a disgrace in this country. Then healthcare and gun violence and the role of money in politics. Those are some major crises facing this country, and they have nothing to do with the intelligence community. But on the intelligence side, there's an important set of threats as well. And just stating them briefly, we always have to protect our fighting men and women in the field. And we've got two forever wars that are still on forever, it seems, particularly in Afghanistan. So the CIA is doing some really good things to help protect those soldiers while they're over there. And then terrorism is something we can't overlook, and particularly as we're beginning to understand domestic terrorism. Now, I think the FBI does a pretty good job of infiltrating some of these extremist groups, particularly the white supremacists, but I'm worried about the Timothy McVeighs of the world in the future, the lone wolves who have a van filled with explosives. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And we can't forget about Al-Qaeda as well. And then as Fred has mentioned, cyber attacks are something we need to be concerned about. I mean, the ultimate horror here is a Pearl Harbor meltdown of the United States, where computers collapse in hospitals, in schools, and police departments, with home and office computers across the country. And then WMD will remain a problem. Imagine the nuclear arsenal that North Korea is building in the hands of a leader who I would say, just to be polite about it, is unpredictable. I could say other things. Economic competition with China. Now here we've decided as a country and as an intelligence community, we're not going to help individual American companies. That's up to them to protect themselves from espionage by and large. But the CIA has a very important role in trying to figure out what the Chinese government is doing in terms of economic policy and pandemic policy, for that matter. The Chinese government was really uncooperative in the early days of the pandemic. And it's the CIA we need to tell us about what the attitude of the government is. And then pandemics. We're going to have more of these. And I think there's a greater role for the CIA to play in warning us about pandemics. A lot of CIA people would say, wait a minute, you're tasking us to death. We already have so many things to do. Now you want us to look for microbes around the world? But I'm just suggesting that the CIA's got people all over the world in some very exotic places in Africa and Asia and so on, and added to their list of things that they need to keep their eyes open about. I think we should be more of a concern for pandemics. Then finally, I would say this CIA ought to seriously consider stealing the Alabama football playbook and giving it to the University of Georgia as soon as it's able to do that.
We all support that that quest for sure. We need for Kirby to be the first former assistant to beat Nick Saban. There would be no disagreement about that, and we won't hold it against Fred for working at Florida State briefly. So Fred, could you tell us a little bit more about your experience being a lawyer at the CIA and what exactly the CIA Office of Legal Counsel does, and also maybe how that department has evolved over time and continues to evolve?
Yeah, it's an interesting history, Brian, and Locke as well, and listeners. Agency was created in 1947. From 47 to 57, there were 2 lawyers doing lawyer work at CIA. From 57 to 67, there were 2 lawyers doing legal work at CIA. In the early 70s, it goes up to about 4, and then it begins to double, and then it doubles again, and then it doubles again, and it doubles again. And when I retired, I don't know the exact number, but it's over 100 attorneys are at the agency doing legal work. I came at a time when Bill Casey was the director, and although he was a lawyer, he had a wonderful quote on an aircraft in which he had offered a ride to Bill Webster, who would succeed him, but Webster was the director of the FBI, and they were discussing programs back in the first Reagan administration. And Director Casey said to Webster, Bill, we got to get these lawyers out of the picture. Judge Webster, who of course had been a judge, one of the straightest arrows I've ever met, politely declined. But when I went to work there, the lawyers had been banished out to an office park out in Northern Virginia, away from the Langley compound, because they had mortally offended Bill Casey in some way. But when Judge Webster came, he moved the office back, appreciated what lawyers could do for people, moved it back to headquarters. And we began to place attorneys in the operational commands and the operational parts of the agency, so that, for example, the unit that dealt with Latin America would have 1 or more attorneys sitting in the offices where the command was for that particular part of the operations directorate, or sitting in the front office of the director of intelligence. And by doing that, we followed a military model where most commands at certain levels and higher levels will have a staff judge advocate there. And it worked great. We were able to help them avoid legal problems and political problems in many ways. We were able to see problems arise before they reached the front page of the Washington Post, or before we had irate phone calls from the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. And that is one of the reasons why there was such a growth, because once the value of an attorney on your own staff was made apparent to the commanders of the agency, they all wanted their own attorney. Before that happened, the Office of General Counsel was like a bureau over in the corner where good plans went to die. Now you had planning that was able to take into account the rules of engagement, which began to multiply in the late 70s. More laws began to apply. The Classified Information Procedures Act, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, Annual Authorization Acts, the two oversight committees. So wending their way between all those areas where legal advice is useful as early as you possibly can get it led to a boom in the office and a much greater appreciation for it. Before the 70s, before Loch intervened, there were not very many US laws that applied to CIA. It did most of its operations overseas involving foreign nationals. Most US laws up until that time are not extraterritorial. That all changed. And so now we have a well developed and long-standing understanding of legal, political, and policy-driven authorities and restrictions on what CIA can do. And that's pretty much what I did for most of my career and most of my colleagues who were there as professionals.
You know, Brian, we talked earlier about the three new appointees in intelligence, Burns and Cohen and Haynes. And of those three, two of them are attorneys. And I share Fred's view that it's very useful to have attorneys in these high positions. They bring a sensitivity to the laws and the Constitution. Bill Colby, I think one of the best CIA directors, coined a phrase which was a little bit awkward, I suppose, but I kind of liked it. CIA, Constitutional Intelligence in America. And I think that the attorneys out there have that in mind, and they do their best to make sure these agencies understand the laws.
Well, and we might say that oftentimes it's better to call your lawyer before you have a problem than afterwards.
Yes.
At least that's how I like to think about things. And I don't mean that only maybe 10% as a joke. It's definitely good to be proactive and thinking about how to, deal with challenging situations with skilled legal advice. So taking a little bit different direction, we've been focusing largely on the CIA tonight, but that's obviously one of many intelligence agencies within the United States. So kind of a two-part question. So one is, what should our audience be thinking about in terms of other intelligence agencies, and maybe which ones are becoming more or less relevant than they have been in the past? But also as a follow-up, what can the administration and the agencies themselves do to work better together, be more efficient, have less infighting, and these sorts of things? Because I've lost count how many agencies there are, 16, 17, there are quite a few. Loch, why don't you take that one?
Yes, well, there are 17, and some would argue maybe that's a few too many, and I'll return to that in a moment. But I would point out that these agencies have different functions, and the idea is to have them work synergistically using all the Black & Decker tools in the box, so that you have the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency taking photographs from space about things we need to know about, such as Russian missile testing sites. We have the National Security Agency, that's the big ear, the listener around the world, and that can be important too. So you could go through each of these 17 organizations and see that they perform important duties. The difficulty is fitting all this information together. And a related difficulty is the overwhelming amount of information. You can drown in this. I once spoke to a director of the NSA, and I said, "What's the biggest problem you've got out here?" And he said, "Well, I feel like I've got a fire hose to my mouth with all the data that's coming in." And in terms of satellite photography, there are about 400 of those photographs that come back to CIA and other agencies every single day. So you can be overwhelmed. Here are a couple of things that I think we need to do, though, that would make all of this work better. The big problem here is siloing or sheltering these agencies within their own organizations so that they don't cooperate well with other agencies. And I think to overcome that, you need a stronger director of national intelligence. The whole idea of the important law passed in 2004, the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, was to finally have a spy master for the United States that could get all of these agencies working together. But unfortunately, as that bill was being passed, it was stripped of powers that really gave the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, authority over budgets and personnel for all of the agencies. Therefore, that position is really quite weak, and it depends more on persuasion and begging than anything. the powers are not there to make these agencies really cooperate with one another. So I would hope we could reform the so-called IRPTA Act so that we could have a true director of national intelligence. And by the way, this would be a radical proposal, I suppose, but I'd like to see that position move back to Langley, where the CIA is, so that you'd have the director of national intelligence in the central, that word is there for a reason, the Central Intelligence Agency, coordinating all the others. And you'd also have a director of the CIA who'd be running the CIA itself. Sort of the old model with the director of Central Intelligence, although back then that person had to run the CIA and run the intelligence community simultaneously. Under the model I'm talking about, you'd have the DNI at the CIA who'd be running the broader community activities, and the director of the CIA would be running the CIA itself. And then, I think that a couple of other ideas, you've got to market intelligence. It's not enough to create an intelligence report. And by the way, the National Intelligence Council produces about 700 reports a year. So there's a deluge of information coming out from the CIA. But the problem is trying to get the consumers who are very busy, the decision makers, to read it and listen to it. And therefore, we have to emphasize to our intelligence professionals that they've got to go over there and develop rapport with the decision makers, get to know them, not where they become buddy-buddy, but at least where there's a relationship where the decision maker will trust the information that's coming in and really do a good job in making sure these people pay attention to the information we've gathered. And then these agencies could really engage in co-location, by which I mean having some national security agency people spend a year at the CIA and vice versa. So these people get used to working one another and break down those silos. I realize some of that already goes on, but I'm suggesting we need more of that. And then I would also like to see us expand our international liaison. The world is a very complicated place, and the United States can't understand by itself what's going on everywhere. So we have the Five Eyes, which is a coalition of the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand that share information. But I don't see why the Five Eyes couldn't be expanded to bring in Germany and a couple of other important allies of ours, because we all need to work together on counterterrorism and other problems. So those are some of the things we can do.
Thank you, Loch. Fred?
Of course, none of that will happen. Loch is a perennial dreamer. There's a story about the DNI when Leon Panetta was director of CIA, and Dennis Blair was the DNI. And Denny Blair, 4-star admiral, former commander of the Pacific Command, his vast fleet out there. And he thought when he was DNI that he might try Loch's idea of exerting some influence over personnel and assignments. And he decided that he would be the one to pick the chiefs of station overseas. And Panetta said, no, that's what the CIA does. But Blair pushed it. And so they went up together to see the vice president, who was Joe Biden. And when they walked into the room or met over the telephone, whatever they did, Panetta said to Mr. Biden, "Sir, are we still on for a tea time tomorrow morning?" And Joe Biden said, yes, we are. Leon, we'll see you there. And Denny knew he'd lost, and he did. And so the appointment of chiefs of station actually stayed in CI's hands. Actually, those are very good suggestions Locke made. Let me pick up one particular one, Locke, about liaison. It's one of the most powerful tools in the CIA toolbox, and I couldn't agree with you more about using it. And I think it has probably fallen into some disrepair under the former administration, just because of the way allies, the Five Eyes and others, France, Germany, and others, were treated by the administration on a diplomatic and trade level, because all intelligence apparatuses reflect the executive desires of whoever's running the country. So I suspect that those were in some need of repair. They are essential to the agency's ability to tell what is going on in other parts of the world. We no more have the ability to even duplicate in any small way the ability of the French to tell us what is going on in former French colonies in Africa, where France is the primary language. We have no more ability to go to countries that have intelligence and understanding about their own citizens or terrorists operating in their own countries. We have maybe one or two person stations in those countries. So relying on liaison and trading favors, photographs from satellites for human sources, is an essential part of what CIA has been doing for a long time. And I agree with Loch completely. It's probably something that needs to be used more in this shrinking world.
Yeah. Well, you do have to be careful though, because we remember the curveball problem, whereby the Germans told us they had an agent who knew a lot about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And it turned out the Germans got that wrong because curveball was a liar. And we accepted the information from Germany, and it helped shape our intervention in Iraq in 2003. So there are some problems with the liaison. Another problem is sometimes these foreign friends of ours have their intelligence services penetrated by our enemies, or the Chinese or the Russians. So you've got to keep your guard up. But generally speaking, we need to cooperate as much as we can with our fellow democracies in trying to understand what these awful autocracies are up to. One other quick point, Fred, to go back to your Panetta Blair example, because that's a wonderful illustration, I think. And I tend to agree with you that I think Blair overreached. But I must say, the CIA needs to be a little more open-minded about who these chiefs of station are, because the bone of contention here was basically Australia. And as you well know, US intelligence in Australia is mainly SIGINT, and the National Security Agency has a huge presence there, and the CIA just has a normal presence. So having an NSA person as chief of station in Australia made some sense to me. So I agree, let's have the DCIA make those appointments, but can we please get him or her to be a little more open-minded for some countries that might benefit from having someone there other than a CIA officer?
Well, I'm sure they're very willing to be open-minded as long as you stay off their lawn, as people often do feel. So touching back to some of the tension in intelligence, and Fred, you talked about U.S. laws not having extraterritoriality in many arena, not just in intelligence, and now that is the case. But it's a nasty world out there. We hold ourselves to high standards as Americans, and we expect our people to do the same. But it's a tough world. It's a nasty world. And how do the intelligence agencies do their job and protect Americans while still upholding American ideals?
It's a never-ending challenge. It'll never be perfected, Brian. The challenges, first of all, are moving. There's a pendulum. As Loch has alluded to, most national intelligence is related to threats. And it's a moving pendulum as to what the people in the United States, but also the political leadership on Capitol Hill and downtown, want the intelligence community to do. Everything from covert actions to interrogations to surveillance. It's a moving pendulum. When the threat is imminent, when the threat is deadly, we are expected to lean forward. When the pendulum swings back, we are told, don't do that anymore. So it is a moving challenge to keep up with that and to match what we can do with what is wanted by the United States. The other problem that I noticed down through the many years is that the rules of engagement, as we set them up and we agree with them and coordinate throughout the government, we coordinate with the Justice Department, State Department, and come up with rules of engagement. They tend to lag behind things like tech. The establishment of the internet tied us into knots about electronic surveillance for years when it first cranked up so big. The nature of the threat, pandemic and climate change, as Loch exactly noted, these are real problems that the president has already announced as crises. The societies here and abroad are changing, and the rules of engagement lag behind the changes in targeting and the changes in technological abilities. And then lastly, this is a perennial problem to people that aren't in the deep dive like Loch and I have been for many years. And that is the false moral equivalency of what the US intelligence community does and that of other countries, adversarial countries, most especially our longtime adversary in Russia, but others, China as well. And I've always answered this by saying, yes, we spy and they spy, but we are a democracy. We are a democracy with oversight, with rigorous rule of law, with a constitution that enshrines individual rights. We have a free press, we have an independent judiciary, and they do not. And there is no moral equivalency. There are, again, as we say, there are no permanent friends and there are no permanent enemies, but there are permanent interests. And to the extent that we are following those in accordance with democratic ideals, I am perfectly happy to say we are not the same as them. And that is something that you have to convince people that while, yes, many of us are skeptics and many more are cynics, but that is a cynicism that is not true.
You know, I couldn't agree more with you, Fred, on that. And I think the whole notion of equivalence between our covert actions and the Russian active measures is totally false. We're doing it for, I would argue, most of the time, noble purposes. But I must admit, though, from time to time, we've crossed lines that we shouldn't have because it makes us look a little more like them, which we're really not at all. And what I have in mind here is when it comes to covert actions, I don't think they ought to be directed toward fellow democracies. In fact, as a general principle, Brian, I would say in answer to your question, we need to have the utmost respect for our fellow democracies around the world. There aren't that many of us, and we're trying to enlarge the number of democracies around the world. We need to work together. And so when Chile has a free and open election and selects Salvador Allende as their leader, we should accept the will of the people of Chile. Now that's back in the 70s, and you can go back to Guatemala even earlier in the 50s, who had another freely elected leader. And by the way, neither one of these people in Chile or Guatemala were communists. Or Mossadegh in Iran was not a communist, and he was freely elected by the parliament of Iran. So in those three cases, we interfered in a democratic regime. Let's take Chile. We did so because, to quote Kissinger, the people of Chile are too irresponsible to pick a good leader. We'll have to do it for them. That, I would suggest to you, is not the right attitude. Now, most of the time, about 95, 98% of the time, the CIA is using its covert action and its espionage activities against hostile autocratic targets who mean us harm. And that's the proper target. The other thing I would mention, Brian, is the whole question of assassination. I would like to see the United States completely swear off assassination, except in a battlefield context or in the extreme emergency of self-defense. But this whole drone business of incinerating people around the world without any due process and sometimes making mistakes, such as wiping out a wedding party in Pakistan, for example, and there are other illustrations, is something we really need to deal with. And by the way, Haynes, the new Director of National Intelligence, was very much involved as an attorney in shaping the rules for drone targeting. And I think it's a total mess. I'm not putting that on her doorstep as the sole person responsible for that, because I think it's a government-wide tangle of confusion about how best to develop these targets. But the British MI6, which has had an off and on long period of time assassinating people that they thought were dangerous to the UK, has sworn off assassinations. And I think we ought to do the same thing. I like the idea, as we did with Kanzi, the fellow who, it makes me sick inside to even think about it, killed a number of people who were on their way to the CIA. They were stopped at a red light, and he walked up to them with a powerful long gun and killed many of them and took off. And we finally captured him a year later, hiding out in Pakistan. We brought him back to the United States. We gave him a free trial, a fair and free trial. He was convicted. In fact, he admitted his own guilt too, and he was executed for his crimes. That's the model that appeals to me, the capture and a fair trial for someone, not just sending a drone over there. You know, when you're that far away, you're too far away to weep what you've done. And the whole business of drone assassination plots bothers me tremendously in terms of the morality of intelligence.
Well, this hour has flown by, so I think we need to start to wrap things up. But on behalf of everyone, I want to thank Fred and Loch for a great discussion tonight. And Loch mentioned briefly, but I'd be remiss if I didn't say, what a wonderful cause the Loch and Lena Johnson Fund is, and it's something that celebrates two great dogs who gave a lot to the university. And I think Lena's definitely done a lot more than Loch, so don't let him tell you otherwise. But so I would encourage all of you to think about that if you're interested in directing your support towards the university towards a specific cause. We can celebrate their contributions and this wonderful night that we've had. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to the dean.
Fred and Loch, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Learned so much. And Brian, thank you for your expert moderation. With that, I think we probably can allow folks to move on with the rest of their evening. Thank you.